Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored that I was chosen as one of the finalists for this prestigious award in the field of human rights. I'm sorry I'm unable to be there with you tonight. Unfortunately, the authorities in UAE have confiscated my passport since 2011 and have put me on travel ban without any legal justification. All of this is happening not because of anything that I have done wrong, but only because of my activities in defending human rights. The presence of a human rights defender from UAE among the finalists for this award may seem strange for some people. The UAE is well known of its oil wealth, the tallest building in the world, the huge shopping malls, the beautiful beaches, and the attractive business environment. However, I hope that my presence as a finalist can show people that we have deep human rights issues in the country that PR companies and a complex network of interest try to dismiss or at least present them contrary to their realities. What worries us the most in recent years in UAE includes the serious repression of free speech and the systematic policy of enforced disappearance of hundreds of people in secret prisons. People are placed in solitary confinement for months without access to the outside world. They are subjected to physical and psychological torture to force confession. That are used later as evidence in politically motivated unfair trials in special courts which has no right of appeal. As a result, we now have hundreds of innocent people spending years of their lives behind bars in an act of cruelty and oppression away from their children and their families. All of the abuses that I have talked about have been documented by international organizations and the United Nations. Not only are the activists punished, but also their families face harassments and repressions. Hundreds of the relatives of the political prisoners, including their children, are on travel ban. Many are deprived of getting a scholarship and getting right to work. Many are not allowed to renew official documents such as passports and are threatened with the withdrawal of their the UAE citizenship, and many are regularly called for interrogation. All of this is accompanied with a fierce campaign of demonization led by the state media and other unofficial media, which constitute the media arms of the security authorities, preventing people from making living by stopping them from getting jobs or running their own businesses, while at the same time preventing them from traveling outside the country, can be a cause of despair that pushes people towards suicide or extremism. All of these human rights abuses coincide with a clear policy of impunity and a complete denial of justice for those whose rights are violated. None of the pre-stated abuses are investigated, and nobody is ever held accountable for these and other violations. This is a small fraction of the abuses practiced in UAE against the activists and the human rights defenders. All of this, however, give us more reasons to defend the human rights. Human rights violations are reality reflected on the ground here, and they are becoming more prevalent and more systematic. This neither serves the governments nor the people, and its cost in the long term become expensive for everyone. We wish that governments understand that we are not criminals and we are not enemies. We love our countries, and what we are doing is a humanistic and true patriotic act, which is a key lever to establishing an environment of respect for human dignity and guarantee the right of people away from extremism and violence in a healthy society.
Between August and September 2014, the UAE authorities detained 10 foreign businessmen of Libyan nationality. These 10 include 2 Canadians and 2 Americans. Many of the detainees have lived in the UAE for over 2 decades and have contributed to its business community and are highly respected. The men were taken by UAE state security agents dressed in civilian clothing without ever being presented with an arrest warrant. Some were arrested from their place of work. another ambushed while driving on the highway, and others in their homes in front of their wives and children and neighbors. Their homes and offices were searched without producing a search warrant. GMC four-wheel drive vehicles customized for kidnapping were used to transport the victims from various cities to a secret prison in Abu Dhabi. The families of the victims quickly notified consular authorities and searched for the whereabouts of their loved ones with no avail for months. Immediately after the detainments, the families reported the kidnappings to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Amnesty International has issued 2 urgent actions, and Human Rights Watch has also issued a report. They have defined the arrests as enforced disappearance and the detainments as incommunicado. Drury Dyke, Middle East researcher for Amnesty International, notes,
Salim and indeed many others are victims in a wide-ranging, comprehensive scenario in which the overall human rights situation in the UAE has plummeted. The interrogations seem to be somewhat systematized, almost scientifically done. What Salim and Mohammed reveal is really quite a tragic story about the Emirates. Hidden behind the face of the modern UAE, the Burj Khalifa, the Burj Al Arab, there is another kind of modern reality which boils down to the severe ill-treatment of innocent people.
The American and Canadian embassies have been restricted in their ability to offer consular support. The UAE is in violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. The detainees have been denied reasonable communication with their family members. The UAE authorities would not share the whereabouts of the detainees with the American and Canadian embassies in Abu Dhabi for several months. To date, no charges, let alone accusations, have been shared with consular officials. Detainees have been denied legal counsel, and their families are not able to engage lawyers until the detainees are placed into the judicial system, which has not happened to date. Requests from lawyers who have attempted to represent some of the detainees have been rejected. In December 2014, 4 of the detainees were released and immediately deported without offering them any reasoning or legal basis for their detainment. These victims believed that they were released because their torture marks had healed after months of interrogation and abuse. Yet the remaining victims were subjected to far more difficult methods of torture, which have not healed to date. After 400 days of arbitrary detainment, the arrests are clearly politically motivated. The UAE has directly intervened in Libyan affairs in hopes of influencing the strategic outcome of a specific faction. The released detainees describe their experience as an information collection campaign about Libya. One of the survivors rationalized their state as prisoners of war. The families have submitted an urgent communication and complaint to the United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteurs in June 2015, and the UAE is currently under investigation. This human rights crisis in the UAE has captured the attention and concern of international human rights organizations and media, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, The Globe and Mail, Vice News, and other media outlets. The families believe, based on credible and serious information, in a recent statement issued by the Libyan Association for Victims of Torture and Enforced Disappearance in UAE, that their loved ones are experiencing serious and life-threatening medical conditions. Some are at the verge of permanent paralysis or dismemberment of a leg. They also are aware of credible evidence of unimaginable torture, and that the detainees have been subjected to over 30 methods of torture employed by UAE local state security agents. These include electrocution, thrown on the ground and continuous relentless beating, boxing ring mass beating by over 20 UAE state security agents, being eaten alive by bugs to force confession, falanga and continuous hitting, forms of waterboarding and freezing, chained and hung upside down and then beaten systematically on all parts of the body, and many other forms of physical, psychological, and sexual torture. According to human rights legal experts who have researched these cases, when the victims were kidnapped and detained, their human rights under international law were violated. The victims were held in incommunicado detention for over 4 months. The victims were not brought promptly before a judge. The victims were not provided with legal representation. The victims were not provided with appropriate access to their family. The victims were not and still have not been informed of the nature and substance of the allegations against them. The victims were subjected to systematic and inconceivable methods of torture. The victims were and still are being denied adequate medical care. The victims were not permitted to challenge the evidence against them. The victims have been denied consular support. Mrs. Gabriella Knoll, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers, explains that the state's security should be under control. Who controls? Who manages? Who is responsible for the state security? Nobody knows. Everyone should be accountable. If there is no accountability, there is no respect for the law. There is no certainty. There is no trust in the justice system. It leaves the door open to any kind of action and will remain impune. Amnesty International has been recently denied to enter the UAE. In 2014, Human Rights Watch was denied, and there are many other examples. Saeed Boumerwa, Amnesty International's Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa, asks, what is the UAE so desperately trying to hide? This shocking move will only further damage the country's reputation, one they are so keen to protect. The UAE signed the UN Convention on Torture in 2012. However, investigations by human rights organizations suggest that cases of torture began to surface only after 2012. The UAE is operating secret prisons that are used to interrogate, torture, and disappear many innocent individuals from across the world. Survivors speak of children and elderly. It is a highly unaccountable system maintained by the security services. One of the survivors describes the secret prison system as a place where screams of torture fill the cells and hallways day and night. Testimonies of survivors pinpoint the secret prison used for torture as located under the Al Dhafra Air Base. Rajija Nemar Al-Karama, Regional Legal Officer for the Gulf, explains that political will is the cornerstone for change. If political will doesn't come from the UAE authorities themselves, they should be pushed by people with whom they share interests, to push them more into the human rights agenda rather than just focusing on security and financial issues. Although organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have denounced the UAE government for these arbitrary arrests, it has not prompted UAE to take any meaningful action. The EU adopted a resolution on the 26th of October 2012 regarding the deterioration of the human rights situation in the UAE. The EU expressed great concern about assaults, repression, and intimidation against human rights defenders, political activists, and civil society actors within the United Arab Emirates who peacefully exercise their basic rights to freedom of expression, opinion, and assembly. The resolution called on the authorities of the United Arab Emirates to halt the ongoing crackdowns immediately.
If you choose to use your status and influence to raise your voice on behalf of those who have no voice, if you choose to identify not only with the powerful but with the powerless, if you retain the ability to imagine yourself into the lives of those who do not have your advantages, then it will not only be your proud families who celebrate your existence, but thousands and millions of people whose reality you have helped change.
For those who have experienced these injustices, and for those still undergoing them, the world's collective voice represents the best chance of attaining justice. The international community should encourage human rights reform in the UAE in return for political and economic privileges. The innocent victims who remain detained should be released immediately.